It was the winter of 1944, and the forests of Western Europe were freezing cold. Snow covered the ground. Trees stood bare and dark. Somewhere in those woods, a group of young American soldiers crouched low and listened. Their lieutenant was gone. He had been hit in the first few minutes of the fight and was now being carried back by two other men. The radio was broken. No orders were coming. The enemy was close, maybe 200 yards away, moving through the trees. Most armies in the world, at that point in history, would have expected those soldiers to stop. To wait. To find someone higher in rank before doing anything. That is how most military forces worked. The men at the top gave the order. Everyone else followed. Without the men at the top, the machine stopped running. But these Americans did not stop. A sergeant named Harold Dunbar, a 23-year-old from a small town in Ohio who had worked at his father's hardware store before the war, looked at the men around him. He did not have a fancy title. He was not trained as an officer. He had never been to a military academy. But he knew exactly what they were trying to do. He knew the mission. He knew the ground. He knew his men. "We keep moving," he said quietly. "Same direction. Same goal. Stay low and stay together." They kept moving. On the other side of the fight, German commanders were paying close attention. They had been watching American forces for months now, since the landings in Normandy in June 1944, through the brutal fighting in France, and now into the dark, wet forests of the German border region. And they had noticed something that bothered them deeply. The Americans were not behaving the way soldiers were supposed to behave. In the German military tradition, which stretched back hundreds of years, command authority flowed from the top downward. Officers were the brain of the unit. Sergeants and privates were the hands and feet. The brain gave the instructions, and the body followed. This was not a flaw in the system, it was the system. German soldiers were well trained, disciplined, and highly capable. But their training assumed there would always be an officer giving direction. When German units lost their officers in battle, they often slowed down. Sometimes they stopped entirely. They waited for new orders. They looked for someone with a higher rank before deciding what to do next. In the fog and confusion of a firefight, without a commander, a German squad could become uncertain, even paralyzed. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to have no such problem. German officers wrote about this in their reports. One senior commander, reviewing accounts of battles in the autumn of 1944, described American enlisted men as dangerously independent. He meant it as a tactical observation, not a compliment. But he could not deny what he was seeing. American platoons kept fighting even when their lieutenants were gone. American squads kept pushing forward even when communication with higher command was cut off. There was something inside the American soldier, some internal compass, that kept the mission going even when the man giving the orders was no longer there. This confused the Germans enormously. And over time, it cost them greatly. To understand why this happened, you have to go back before the war. You have to look at how the United States Army decided to train its soldiers, and why those decisions were so different from what other armies were doing. In the years before America entered World War II, military leaders in Washington spent a great deal of time studying the mistakes of World War I. That earlier war had been a disaster in many ways, millions of men lost in battles that gained almost nothing, leaders making decisions from far behind the front lines, soldiers told to advance into impossible situations simply because an officer gave the order and questioning it was not permitted. The men who redesigned the American Army in the late 1930s and early 1940s wanted something different. They wanted soldiers who could think. They wanted sergeants who understood not just what the order was, but why the order had been given, what the larger mission required, what the goal was 2 steps ahead, what would need to happen if the plan fell apart. This was written directly into the training manuals. Every soldier, regardless of rank, was supposed to know the commander's intent, the purpose behind the mission, not just the mechanics of it. A private digging a foxhole was expected to understand what the entire platoon was trying to accomplish. A corporal leading a foreman team was expected to know his company's objective, not just his own small piece of it. The Army also made a deliberate decision to invest in its non-commissioned officers, its sergeants and corporals. These were the men who sat between officers and enlisted soldiers. In many armies, they were treated almost as a lower class, useful for discipline and grunt work, but not expected to lead in any real sense. The American Army took a different view. Sergeants were trained in map reading, in calling in fire support from artillery, in basic tactics, in how to communicate with units on their left and right. They were given real responsibility during training exercises, including exercises where the officer was deliberately removed halfway through, forcing the sergeant to finish the mission on his own. The message was clear and it was repeated constantly: the mission does not stop because the leader goes down. Someone steps up. The mission continues. There was something else at work, too, something that went deeper than training manuals and military doctrine. Something that had to do with where these young men had come from. The American soldiers of World War II were mostly ordinary young men from ordinary places. Farmers from Kansas. Factory workers from Pittsburgh. Shop owners from Georgia. Students from California who had never been more than 50 miles from home. They came from a society that, despite all its problems and contradictions, had a strong tradition of individual initiative. Americans were raised to solve their own problems. They were expected to make decisions. They were not trained from childhood to wait for an authority figure to tell them what to do in every situation. This cultural habit, this reflex of taking initiative, turned out to be a military advantage of enormous value. A German soldier who lost his officer was, in many cases, a soldier without a compass. An American soldier who lost his officer was, more often than not, a soldier who remembered what the compass was pointing toward and kept walking. This is not to say that American soldiers were without fear or doubt. They were human beings, many of them teenagers, many of them terrified. Letters home from that period are filled with descriptions of exhaustion, cold, confusion, and grief. These were not superhuman men. They were ordinary people in an extraordinary situation. What made the difference was not courage alone. Courage is something you will find in soldiers of every army in every war. What made the difference was that their training and their culture had given them something to fall back on when everything else was gone. They had a reason. They had a goal. And they had been taught, over and over again, that the goal did not disappear just because the situation got hard. Consider the forests of Hurtgen, near the German border, in November 1944. It was one of the most difficult and costly battles American forces fought in the entire war. The trees were so thick that artillery shells hit the branches above the soldiers' heads and exploded before reaching the ground, sending shrapnel downward. The mud was deep. The cold was constant. Men fell every few minutes. German commanders specifically aimed their fire at American officers and radio operators. The logic was simple: remove the head, and the body stops moving. In engagement after engagement, American platoon leaders were hit early in the fighting. And in engagement after engagement, the units they led kept going. Sergeants who had never expected to lead a platoon suddenly found themselves in charge of one. Sometimes it was a corporal. Sometimes, in the most desperate moments, it was a private who stood up and said, "Follow me." The Germans who survived those battles and were captured later described a kind of frustrated disbelief. They had done exactly what their doctrine told them to do. They had removed the officers. And it had not worked. The Americans had kept coming. Then came December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Germany launched its largest offensive on the Western Front, pushing through the forests of the Ardennes in Belgium and Luxembourg, catching the Allies by surprise. American units were split apart. Supply lines were cut. In many areas, soldiers had no contact with their commanders and no clear picture of what was happening around them. What those soldiers did in the hours and days that followed became one of the most studied episodes in military history. Without orders, without radio contact, sometimes without knowing where the front line was, small groups of American soldiers made their own decisions. They set up roadblocks at key crossroads. They destroyed bridges before enemy forces could cross them. They found one another in the snow and fog and formed improvised defensive positions. They slowed the German advance in 100 small ways that no single officer planned or coordinated. One of the most famous points of resistance was the town of Bastogne. American forces surrounded there, cut off from supply and reinforcement, refused to give up the town even when German commanders demanded it. But Bastogne was only the most visible part of the story. Behind it, in dozens of unnamed roads and frozen fields, small groups of American soldiers were making independent decisions that ground the German offensive to a halt. The Germans had planned for a fast, decisive breakthrough. They had not planned for an enemy that kept fighting even when no one was telling it to fight. By the time spring came in 1945 and Allied forces crossed the Rhine River into Germany itself, the contrast between the two armies had become undeniable. German resistance was fierce in places, but it was increasingly fragile. When German units lost communication with their headquarters, they often became confused. When their officers fell, they sometimes stopped moving entirely, waiting for direction that never came. American units, moving through the same chaos, kept advancing. Companies that lost their captains continued moving toward their objectives. Platoons that had no contact with battalion headquarters used their training and their judgment and pushed forward anyway. The war diary of a captured German officer from the period contains a line that has been quoted by military historians ever since. He wrote, simply, that the Americans fought as though they did not need permission to win. He was right. And that was exactly what had been built into them. After the war ended, military analysts from many countries studied what had made the American army so effective. They found many things: better equipment in some areas, superior logistics, air power that changed the shape of every battle. But among the officers and historians who dug deepest into the question, one factor kept rising to the surface. It was not tanks. It was not planes. It was the sergeant. The American NCO, the non-commissioned officer, was, in the judgment of many military experts, the most effective junior leader produced by any army in the war. Not because American sergeants were braver or stronger than their counterparts, but because they had been trained to think, to decide, and to lead in the absence of those above them. They had been trusted with real knowledge and real responsibility. And when the moment came, as it always came in battle, they were ready. The United States military studied those lessons carefully after 1945. The doctrine of mission command, the idea that every soldier should understand the purpose behind the mission, not just the mechanics of executing it, became a formal cornerstone of American military thinking. It was taught at every level, from basic training for new recruits to the advanced courses attended by generals. It was updated and refined through Korea, Vietnam, and the decades that followed. Armies around the world eventually began to study it, copy it, and adapt it. But it had started in those frozen woods, in those muddy fields, in those shattered towns, with young men from ordinary places who had been taught one simple but powerful idea: the mission does not stop because the leader goes down. There is something worth thinking about in all of this that goes beyond military tactics and doctrine. The German officers who puzzled over American behavior in their after-action reports were trying to solve a tactical problem. They were asking, why do these units keep fighting without their officers? But underneath that tactical question was a deeper one, and it is a question that applies far beyond the battlefield. What is the source of a person's motivation? Where does it live, inside the person, or in the authority above them? Is someone capable only when they are being told what to do, or do they carry their purpose with them wherever they go? The American soldiers of World War II gave one answer to that question, in field after frozen field. They showed that when people truly understand why something matters, when they have been trusted with real knowledge and real responsibility, they do not need to be pushed. They move on their own. They lead themselves. They find a way forward even when the road has disappeared. Harold Dunbar, the sergeant from Ohio, survived the war. He went home to his father's hardware store. He never wrote a book or gave a famous speech. He was not a general. He was just a man who, on one cold winter morning in a European forest, looked at the men around him and said, simply, that they were going to keep moving. And they did. That is the real story, not the story of a great army, but the story of what a great army is actually made of. Not the officers who give the orders, but the ordinary people who understand, down to their bones, why the orders matter in the first place. The Germans saw it happen. They wrote it down. They studied it. And they were never quite able to stop it. Because you cannot stop something that does not need your permission to begin. End.